For the past 3 years, I've been busy world building. Pairing physical models with interconnected short stories, I've been painstakingly crafting the world of Aegis. Today's project will take us back to the polar region of Fis Alim, where we previously met KP-1301, but this time I'll be attempting something I've never done before, a hand-painted cross-section illustration. This is Gamey Builds, and welcome to Beyond the Blight. For as long as I can recall, I've been obsessed with these Star Wars cross-section books. When I was just a little kid, I wanted nothing more than to find a quiet corner of Barnes & Noble, pull one of these books off the shelf, and slowly page through the illustrations, combing over every detail. Seeing the internals of my favorite ships and vehicles, coupled with these detailed captions, did so much to bring to life this galaxy far, far away. And achieving this level of complexity and cohesiveness has always been my goal in building the world of Aegis. So it was only natural that eventually I'd attempt my own cross-section illustration, but where would I even start with something like this? It turns out that there are not a whole lot of videos on this subject here on YouTube, and other than some Pinterest boards, there aren't too many online resources dedicated to this very specialized form of artwork. I did, however, stumble upon the website of Hans Jensen, one of the 2 original Star Wars cross-section illustrators. His website was a treasure trove of information, explaining his process and even listing a few of Hans's supplies. I also sent him a message on his website with a few additional questions, though I really wasn't too hopeful for a response. Armed with this helpful info, it was time to go shopping. I needed a ton of drawing and drafting equipment, like rulers, straight edges, and of course, a giant sheet of watercolor paper. I also picked up a bunch of new brushes, pens, and this stencil. Now I just needed a subject to draw. Fortunately, there was something I had in mind. As many of you know, for the past 2 years, I've been chipping away at my first full-length Beyond the Blight novel. A good chunk of it happens on the southern region of Fis Alim, and Beltora Station, an underground bunker, features heavily in the story. To visualize the station's layout, I'd already developed a rough map in this sketchbook. So it seemed like a good subject to cross-sectionalize. I started by digitally drawing the layout, beginning with the walls and eventually mapping out the plumbing, electrical systems, and heating and ventilation. Each room and space mentioned in the book also had to be accounted for, and I was careful to keep the design details consistent with my story. With the design finally finished and printed, it was time to extrapolate this top-down view into an isometric sketch. Now, because I'd never done anything like this before, I had a lot of experimentation to do, which eventually led me to this discovery. By drawing lines at 30 and 150 degree angles, you can create a perfectly isometric cube, where all sides are the same length. In addition, to draw circles on the faces, this oval stencil created the perfect perspectively accurate shape. There's also a way to do this manually with a protractor, but this stencil would save me a lot of time. Armed with this knowledge, but still feeling totally overwhelmed by the prospect of filling the paper with a hyper-detailed illustration, there was nothing left to do but begin. One thing I eventually realized, too late in the process, was that I really should have started with a drawing study of mechanical parts, things like engine blocks and turbines. I think that intrinsic knowledge of mechanical systems is the secret ingredient to really pulling off one of these illustrations, and something that, unfortunately, my final illustration lacks. Still, I pressed on, and as the days passed, I added to my arsenal of tools with this angled ruler, which kept my angles consistent. With the walls drawn in, I then began the tricky process of figuring out what needed to be cut away. This did require repositioning some of the interior furniture and a few of the doors and doorways, but this was about the point where I started getting excited about the illustration before me because it felt like it was coming together. To be honest, my own willingness in taking on these extensive, grueling projects sometimes surprises me. There's no way I would have attempted anything like this years ago, and that reveals to me that, along with improving in some artistic disciplines since starting this channel, the most valuable takeaway for me has been patience and discipline, things that are applicable to other areas of life. These projects are also humbling. To quote the American physicist John Archibald Wheeler, "We live on an island surrounded by a sea of ignorance. As our island of knowledge grows, so does the shore of our ignorance." I think that beautifully describes the feeling I have whenever I dip my toes into a new form of art, and certainly the way I felt with this cross-section drawing. It was like turning the corner along the shore of a coastline, thinking I was about to finally discover the boundary of my island, only to see miles upon miles of additional coast. Next came the fun bits, the details: pipes, lockers, consoles, furniture, this water filter, and so on. Because it was my very first time doing something like this, every item presented a unique problem. How would I space the stairway steps evenly, and how could I keep these curved doorways consistent? A lot of time was spent merely looking at this thing and figuring out what to draw next. But after a week of sketching, I was ready to ink. Yep, I know what you're thinking. I'm a madman for attempting these lines freehand, and you are correct. Thinking back, I was initially worried that dragging a wet felt tip along a straight edge would be a recipe for disastrous ink smudges, but these lines were awful, so I quickly switched to using rulers and just being very careful. Still, this was stressful, and you can actually hear me holding my breath in the original audio. Leaving the felt tip on the paper too long made ink blots, moving it too quickly made for faint lines. It was so finicky. But as I got the hours under my belt, I began to figure out where the sweet spot was. Still, there were plenty of mistakes made here, with lines crossing parts of the drawing they shouldn't have, some angles being totally off, and in spite of my best efforts, some obvious pen marks and smudges. But there was nothing I could do at this point but persist and try to figure out a way to fix it later. Aside from the stress, this was exhausting, tedious work. I began to fret over the placement of every single line, fearing yet another mistake. I obsessively checked and double-checked everything, greatly extending the time of the project. Now, you might be thinking that that's the reason why it's been so long between videos, but actually the long delay since my last project is due to something else. You see, after releasing my video in December, I took a bit of a YouTube hiatus to focus on my novel. I'm happy to announce that in January, I finally began sharing the manuscript with my small team of editors and beta readers. The resulting feedback has been incredible, helping me to polish up some of the rough spots and fiddle here and there with things like dialogue and exposition. The process has also sparked a few interesting conversations about the themes and events in the story, forcing me to delve even deeper into world building and flesh out some of the scenes that previously had been a bit bare. It's been a blast, and I can't wait to share the finished book, which will be releasing this summer. A limited edition of signed and numbered hard copies will also be available, and this cross-section illustration will play a part in that release, so stay tuned. In the meantime, I'm thrilled to release this brand new Beyond the Blight t-shirt, based on my tram heist build from last year. The design is also available on these super sleek posters, and you can find all this and more, including these stickers and patches, on my website, gameybuilds.com. After weeks of standing at my desk, I realized it was time to rethink things, as the painting process would be lengthy and strenuous. So it was good timing when FlexiSpot reached out to me with an offer to try out their C7 Max premium office chair. The instructions were simple and straightforward, and soon I'd gotten all the pieces unpacked and assembled. Some of my personal favorite features are the lumbar support panel here, which I found keeps me from slouching, the way it reclines with just the right amount of force and stays in place, these swiveling armrests with adjustable height, and a handy little footrest for watching YouTube while chilling at my desk during breaks. It's by far the most comfortable office chair I've ever owned, and an easy recommendation for anyone who spends a lot of time at their desk. And if I'm being totally honest, I was content to just sit in this new chair and veg. I'd spent countless hours on this project, but felt I had very little to show for it. I hate to admit this, but I was on the verge of giving up, until I checked my email. I could hardly believe my eyes.
people out the door in the mornings.
Yeah.
I work from home, so I can relax now.
Excellent. Very good. The first question was, how did you get into doing the cross-section cutaway illustrations? Where did that come from?
Well, I loved cutaway art ever since I was a very young kid, ever since I can remember. And I used to get a comic called Eagle when I was very, very young, and they had every issue had a
Mr. Jensen was an absolute joy to chat with. He shared his experiences working with Lucasfilm on the iconic books and even explained his process. You can find the full unabridged 30-minute conversation on my Patreon, but suffice it to say, I was totally fired up and ready to put brush to paper. One of my biggest takeaways from my discussion with Hans was his reasoning behind using gouache as opposed to watercolors, which has until now been my go-to medium for painting. He explained that gouache was more opaque, resulting in flexibility during painting, and incidentally, it was effective in hiding mistakes. I was sold and purchased this huge set of Himi brand gouache. Now, if you're wondering whether there will be a story for this video, yes, I know how much all of you look forward to those, so don't go anywhere. But first, let me share a few things I learned about using gouache to paint. Most importantly, gouache can be reactivated at any time with water. Being used to oil and acrylic paints with my models, this was a really tricky thing to get used to. It was extremely important to not have too much water on the brush when adding layers of paint, since that could easily reactivate and smear the underlying coats. Starting with the subterranean layers of snow and ice was definitely the right move though, as these flat, open spaces were relatively easy to quickly fill with color. Here too, though, I had to be careful, as the opaqueness of the paint meant that I could easily cover over the line work, and I really didn't want to have to redraw everything later. It took me a while to finally understand how gouache changes colors as it dries too, with darker colors drying lighter and lighter colors drying darker. All of these idiosyncrasies made it a real challenge to get used to, but with practice, I began getting the hang of it. Still, this part alone took me the better part of 2 days to finish, which made me quite nervous about the rest of the project, which would be much more intricate and colorful. But for that, I'll let you watch while I tell my latest short story. I've always been better off alone. When I first relocated to the ice shelf with Heedman, there were doubters. They said this place would be the death of me, that this frail little woman from the plains wouldn't endure a single season in the polar desert. Those unbelievers claimed it wasn't good for the mind to dwell so long in isolation. They were of the unflagging belief that if I didn't succumb to one form of failure, another would be waiting for me just around the corner until my doom was quite certain. But let the record show that I am still here, and quite well. The fact is, what others called bleak, I deemed peaceful. Where others saw only desolation, I saw the promise of solitude. "Oh, don't go, you'll freeze to death in that awful place, and what about your medicine?" my mother had howled at me one day. You should have seen the look in her eyes. It was as if I were volunteering to jump into an active volcano. I told her not to be so dramatic. I should note that at this point her sickness was quite advanced. Half the time she didn't even know it was her daughter she was talking to. Keep that in mind before judging me too harshly for abandoning her. Her own mind had done that long ago. I was getting older, and I had to do what was best for me, and there was no future left on the mainland. Everyone with half a brain could see it. They were all in denial, of course, too comfortable in their old lives to see the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. That revelation was unavoidable. If there was a failure to be claimed, it was their own, for they failed to see the potential of Fis Alim. It's cold, yes, and the winters are long, and the winds are strong, blah blah boo-hoo. What else would you expect on the southern pole? But a place is more than a number on a thermograph, just as a person is more than the digits of their age. I was 52 when we moved in, if you must know. Plenty of good years ahead of me, and it wasn't as if I'd be out braving white wallers and hunting game. We could rely on the energy farm on the hill. Solar cells, turbines, and enough battery storage to hold us over through the dark season. We would sell what extra we didn't use, or we'd trade our batteries with the other settlers for the supplies we needed. And that's what you really need to make it out here on the ice shelf. A strong, resourceful mind. That's worth 10 times its weight in fat and muscle. The kilogram or so of lumpy grey matter between your ears is worth more than the rest of you. That's what I've always said anyway. And my mind was so healthy in this place that it had gone and fixed itself. That's what determination and good old elbow grease can accomplish. Brains are so interesting, wouldn't you say? The fact that two people can see and hear the exact same thing and come away with an entirely different experience because their brains tell them so. It's simply amazing. Where Heedman saw only blank fields of rock and snow, I saw a whole palette of colors and possibilities. Where Heedman heard the unnerving screeching of the winds outside our bunker, I heard the music of ice crystals dancing on our doors. They would sing to me sometimes. I would paint those songs, and to think they called me crazy for hauling all my painting supplies way out here, but I'm glad I did. Those songs were very faint, of course, and they didn't sing like you and I because nature has its own way of vocalizing. But if I sat just within the inner vault doors and pressed my ear to the cold metal and just listened, sometimes I would hear songs. Oh, life on Fisalim, it was so untroubled. If only it had developed as we hoped. If only more souls had been brave. If a 52-year-old woman could do it, why couldn't they? Well, I suppose many would end up like Heedman anyway, even if they did come. They'd eventually grow tired of it, or grow tired of their partners anyhow. If you want to know, I think it was plain old rotten jealousy that did him in. I was strong enough to survive here, so the fact that he was struggling to maintain himself meant I was better. Heedman, you know the type, I'm sure, dear. He would have none of that. He tried to poison me, would you believe it? I actually saw him grinding up those awful little pills and trying to mix them into my food. It would have done me in if I hadn't caught him in the act. Oh, that face he made when he turned from the counter and saw me watching him. I've only been hunting once. A neighbor of ours, Chelt his name is, had insisted we learn to do it. I had actually needled a snow hare in my first hour, and that look in its eyes when the poisoned dart sank into its back leg, that look was less terrified than how pathetic Heedman looked at that moment in my kitchen. "You're trying to kill me," I said. Oh, well, it may have been more of a scream. Those were the words anyhow. I'm not, Heedman insisted, but his face was as red as a coastal sunset. I almost laughed at how absurd his little lie was. "You must take your pills. I will not lose you to the sickness," Heedman said, and would you believe there were actually tears in his eyes, as if crying was going to convince me of anything. I'm not one to be fooled by theatrics, however, and I held my ground. "If it's not poison, prove it," I demanded. I sounded strong, but I admit I was nervous. The man was liable to reach behind him, open a kitchen drawer, and pull out a knife on me. If the man wanted me dead, there was little I could do to stop him. I could only outwit him, you see. Heedman was weeping now, tears streaming down his face like one of our wall pipes sprung a leak. He was insisting that I wasn't myself, that the singing voices were proof that solitude had been bad for me, that we'd made a mistake, and he was so sorry, and so on ad nauseum. And I just let it wash over me. I was the bunker now. Deep underground, my roots like solid concrete walls holding me down, and his words were just a harmless wind racing right over the top of me, and now I finally understood those songs. All this time, Fisalim had been preparing me for this very moment. So I said, "If it's not poison, show me. You take it." Oh, those were clever words indeed. His tears stopped. Just like that, proving that the whole thing had been in act. He still wore that sad plastic face of his, of course. And then he nodded, like a man headed for the Capitol chamber, and he took a bite. And that brings us to me calling you. You are a doctor, aren't you? From her kneeling position on the floor, Freya Hodis snapped shut her medical kit and looked up sadly at the woman. Medicine bottles of sedatives and antipsychotics littered the kitchen countertop. It had been a strong dose, and Heedman Pelder was old. "I'm afraid he's dead, Ina," Freya said somberly. "Ah, so that settles it then. It was poison. Well, justice served then. As I've always said, I am so much better off alone." Thank you all so much for watching. While this project took much longer than expected, I learned so much. And if you'd like to see more painting projects in the future, let me know in the comments. Oh, and if you're in the market for an office chair, FlexiSpot is having a big sale right now. And by using the code C750, you can get an extra $50 off your order. Until next time, this is Gamey Builds. Over and out.